So in chapter 3, when we were talking about supply and demand, we talked about how the market with supply and demand generated an equilibrium, and that equilibrium, that there was a certain beauty to it, and that beauty was that without any special knowledge or really anything like that, that market participants, be they the producer or the consumer, that they respond to shortages and surpluses existing, and that the seller adjusts their price based on whether a surplus or a shortage exists, and that by the act of then changing the price, it then changes the quantity demanded and quantity supplied, and that these changes basically keep on occurring until the market reaches a point where the quantity demanded equals the quantity supplied, or what we would call equilibrium. Now, the curious thing is that as well as that system works for finding the equilibrium price, the market doesn't always let that be the case. And that would be where we start to see price controls. And that what price controls involve is an attempt, typically by the government, an attempt to make the price something other than the equilibrium price. Now, this isn't a anti-government, pro-market discussion here, but when people do surveys of what economists all agree on, and that there's quite a few things that economists don't agree about, but when they do these surveys, that generally speaking, economists do come out opposed to price controls. And so, again, don't interpret this as me saying rah-rah to markets and boo to government. Rather, just think of it as me being an economist, sharing with you what economists generally interpret as the most efficient outcome. And that would be one where the market determines the price rather than the price being controlled or determined outside of the market. Okay. So what we would see in any sort of situation is a situation where once we, I need to go to draw, that we could create a situation where we have price and quantity, demand and supply, and then obviously here's our equilibrium. With equilibrium price and equilibrium quantity. And that what this slide is referring to here is that the area below the demand curve to the price is known as consumer surplus. And that the area below the equilibrium price to the supply curve is known as the producer surplus. And by a surplus, what we mean is that there's a difference, for the consumer at least, that there's a difference between the highest price they would have been willing to pay, which is represented by the demand curve, and the price that they actually paid. And that continues on all the way until this customer right here pays exactly the price they were willing to pay. So we sum that up, and we can see that the consumer surplus, again, this area below the demand curve to the price, the supply curve, the area above the supply curve to the price, and that total area is maximized at the equilibrium. And that leads to the conclusion here, as the last bullet point highlights here, that markets generate the maximum sum of consumer surplus and producer surplus, and that they generate efficient results. So this right here is why economists love markets. That consumers and producers feel the greatest satisfaction, and that these results are maximum efficiency. So in terms of allocation of goods, things are maximized. Now, in the previous chapter, chapter 4, there was a discussion of how taxes can possibly generate a deadweight, what's called a deadweight loss. Now, not all semesters am I dealing with chapter 4. So if you weren't assigned it, you don't need to do it. But if you were assigned it, you would obviously be responsible for it. But let me just say something very briefly here. What chapter 4 was trying to say is that if there's no taxes, then you've got a situation where the consumer surplus and the producer surplus is maximized. So again, this would be either review for you. If you did look at chapter 4, it would be new to you if you didn't, but I'll give you the information you need. That what we see here is that if a tax is involved, let's say it's a tax on the seller, that the consumer surplus is reduced, the producer surplus is reduced, this amount is the tax revenue, and that most importantly for economists, what was generated was this little triangle right here, which is referred to as the deadweight loss. It's a loss in efficiency that no one captures, and that's the thing that economists don't like. Depending on the kind of good that you tax, whether it be a good that's elastic or inelastic, what you could see is that the deadweight loss can become smaller if the good is more inelastic, meaning less sensitive to price changes. Now, what we need to do in this chapter is we need to talk about how does that understanding of consumer surplus, producer surplus, how does that affect things when we have price ceilings occurring, and that what we would end as well as price floors occurring. So those are the two types of price controls that are imposed: a price ceiling and a price floor. And what we're going to see here is that a price floor is a law that says it's a law that says price can't go any lower, and the price ceiling is a law that says the price can't go any higher. So you can't go any higher than a ceiling, no lower than a floor, just like in a house. Now, each of these types of laws have economic consequences, have consequences on economic activity, as we'll see in this chapter. Okay, so where do we see these things? Price ceilings, we see them when people think, the government thinks, that prices are unfairly too high. Pick your own natural disaster. Here in Hawaii, with the fires on Maui, the governor placed a law that said that you couldn't raise the price on like generators or building supplies after the fire occurred, because to do so would be unfair and it would represent companies being too greedy. So the price was stopped from rising any higher than it was before the disaster. Price floor, you see this most often with something like the minimum wage, where it sets a situation where the price can't go any lower than a certain amount. Now, what this slide tries to highlight here, though, is that you can put a price ceiling or a price floor wherever you want, but it only has an impact in one region. Specifically, that with demand and supply, if I were to put, for instance, if I were to put the price control right here, price ceiling right here, the result would be, who cares? This would be a non-binding price ceiling. And the reason why is because the price would go to right here, the equilibrium price, and it's not going to go higher than even the equilibrium price. So who would care about a law that says it can't go way up here? Probably the best way to understand this would be take a product that we all know very well. Let's just say we're talking about gasoline, okay? And let's just say that it's $4 a gallon. Well, what if I have a law, a price ceiling law, that says the price can go no higher than $10 a gallon? Well, who cares, right? The price is $4. It's not going to go higher than $4, at least permanently. And so who cares about a law that says that it's going to be, can't go higher than 10? But people would care about a price ceiling down here. Again, let's use gasoline as our example. $4, but now I have a price ceiling law that says it can go no higher than 2. That would have an impact. And look at what it does. A binding price ceiling, meaning an effective price ceiling, has a consequence of creating shortages. And that's what generally economists don't like about price controls, be they a price ceiling or a price floor, is that it causes a shortage. And so what you can see in disaster areas is that you, as a government official, come out like Mr. Nice Guy or Mrs. Nice Person because you have said that, greedy Lowe's or greedy Home Depot can't raise the price on lumber. But then the problem is that everyone rushes to buy this lumber that they need, and thus there's a shortage. That same kind of discussion can occur here for price floors. And with the price floor, again, you can put it anywhere you want. You can make that kind of law anywhere you want. But if I put it down here, and again, let's make this now the minimum wage, right? So let's say that the minimum wage is $7.25 an hour. And I say that the wage can go no lower than 5. Well, who cares, right? It's $7.25. It's not going to go lower than 5, at least not permanently. But if I put it up here, let's say at $20 an hour, and this is still $7.25. Well, that is a price floor that would have an effect, because that would force the price to go no lower than 20. But look at what it does. When it's binding, it has a consequence of creating a surplus. And so what we see with the minimum wage is that you come across as being, again, a really nice person. You're saying, if you're willing to work, you're going to get $20 an hour. But the problem is that there's not enough jobs out there that are paying $20 an hour. And so some people are lucky to get the job, but others are not going to be unemployed. And so that's what we see right here. Again, we see that the price control, that is any attempt to basically make the price something other than what the market would have had it be. The price ceiling is a law that sets the maximum price. The price floor is a law that sets the minimum price. You can put these ceiling and floor prices anywhere you want. There's only one region where it's binding, meaning that it has an effect. And so we could just say here very briefly, it's only impactful, or it has a consequence, when it's below the equilibrium price, and that the price floor is only impactful when it's above the equilibrium price. Okay, I'm just going to skip this kind of things. I've already talked about some of these price controls. We saw them a lot, for instance, after World War II, when people were coming back from the war and people were basically spending too much. We would see them even in the 1970s. We would see price controls under the Nixon administration. We see price controls today with this discussion about the minimum wage, and that the minimum wage, quite honestly, is different in different cities, different states. California, for instance, it's I think it is $20 an hour at restaurants, except for Panera. So again, I've talked about some of this already, so I don't want this video to get way too long here. But if I just speak very briefly again, let's say again we have a price ceiling on bread of 50 cents a loaf. What would be some of the consequences? Again, if you were to draw that out, what you're looking at here is that, okay, I've got a law that says basically no more than or no higher than that price. So then again, what matters here is what is the equilibrium? Let's say that the equilibrium is $2. So the price ceiling here let's say is 50 cents. And look what that happens. There's my quantity supplied. There's my quantity demanded. And my quantity demanded is greater than my quantity supplied at 50 cents. Meaning that I've got a shortage. And so you could kind of, look through this situation here, but in essence, what you would force to have happen here is that either the loaf of bread would have to get smaller, would have to be lower quality, it'd be more difficult to find, or what price ceilings also do is they cause people to leave the legal market and try to get the good in the illegal market, right? And we see this certainly, for instance, with the minimum wage, right, is that you can see individuals working for cash, right? And they would do that because they just want to get a job, but they have to accept in cash some wage that's lower than the minimum wage. And that's the only way they can get to work. what this slide is just highlighting here again is that you can put the price wherever you want, but it only has an impact, it only has meaning in one place. This, as we can see here, would be an example where the price ceiling does not have any impact. This would be saying that the price can go no higher than $2. Who cares? It's $1. It's not going to go higher than $2. So this would be like a wah, wah. Doesn't matter. Has no effect. Here's where it would have impact, thus causing a shortage. If the equilibrium price is $1 and you say you cannot charge more than 50 cents, then that price ceiling will be effective. It will have an impact. But that impact is unfortunate because the impact is that it causes a permanent shortage in the market. Again, great publicity. Shows you're a champion of the working person. You're guaranteeing they're going to get 50-cent loaves of bread. Or at least that the price will be 50 cents. You just can't even guarantee that they'll get it at 50 cents because there's obviously a shortage. So you either have to be lucky and get in line first to get that 50-cent loaf, or you're going to end up paying more than 50 cents a loaf in the illegal markets, the black market. And that what we then see is that the shortage will actually get larger over time. And that the reason why that's the case is that you've got the illegal market operating. And that possibly as well, in that illegal market, the quality of the good might be better. It's just easier to get. But it could make people, if there's an illegal market where it charges $1.50, you could make people really desperate to try to want to get it at that ceiling price of 50 cents. So again, practice what you know. I don't generally do these, but this is correct. If it's non-binding, meaning it doesn't have an impact, meaning it's above the equilibrium price, then there would be no effect. And what does the illegal market, what does it do? It basically resolves the shortage by giving access to the product in a way that the legal market couldn't satisfy. But what happens is that in the long run, the shortage that's caused by an impactful price ceiling actually gets worse over time. And that's because the consumers, in terms of their demand, and the producers, in terms of their supply, that demand and supply will become even more elastic, thus making the shortage even larger than it was before. Okay. So, we see rent controls, for instance, are famously in New York, and it means that rent-controlled apartments are either the dumpiest apartments or they're incredibly difficult to get. Or what they end up having to do is they end up having to find different ways to charge tenants for things to create a situation where they could just get more revenue for the unit with the hope that the person will be moving out. And, this graph, you can look at it and you say, it looks pretty confusing. But basically what's happening is that, again, in the short run, the transition to the long run is that both the supply and demand curve become more elastic, thus expanding the supply, the amount of the shortage. And again, what you generally would see is that when you have price controls, the seller doesn't really face a strong incentive to be supplying the product, making sure that it stays in stock, and as well, you're not going to see a situation where they want to maintain the quality of the product that they're producing, or even really care what consumers want in the first place. again, these are pretty popular. We saw this, and this slide kind of highlights here too. We saw these price controls during COVID, when we had price controls on masks, when we had price controls on hand sanitizer, on Clorox wipes. What did it lead to? It led to even larger shortages. And there's this pretty funny example. I think it's funny. If you type into like Google and you type in like price gouging, hand sanitizer, and Amazon, you'll find this guy that was like in like Tennessee or Kentucky or something like that. And basically he saw COVID was starting to happen, that everyone wanted hand sanitizer, and that he went to every like Walmart and every store he could find, and he would buy up all the hand sanitizer. Then he was going on Amazon and reselling it for really high prices. And then basically the states imposed all these price controls, and this guy got stuck with like a garage full of hand sanitizer. But yet at the same time, other people are going to say that they can't, other people are going to say that they can't get it. So again, what's the, from my perspective, if I was a politician, I guess that kind of pricing law is again going to be popular with voters, but it's not going to have a positive economic effect on the people. Hopefully they're just temporary, but again, you create a situation where the consumers might not get the things that they actually want. It's just that some people might get really lucky and be able to get that product at that temporarily low price. Okay. So what could you do, right? What you could do is you could try to create a situation where maybe you subsidize the product, during a time when things are really expensive. Or what you could do is you could maybe, if you're facing a non-emergency situation, you could make the price a little bit higher so that you could use that money to then counteract for times when things would be a little bit more expensive, kind of try to smooth things out. That'd be about the best way to do it. Okay, I'm going to pause here. So from price ceilings, we transitioned to talking about price floors. And so now what we're talking about is the points in time where the equilibrium price is deemed as maybe higher than what we would want it to be for social reasons. So what the price floor does is it makes the price artificially higher. And this obviously has consequences. So again, if you're talking about where do you put such a price floor, again, just to review for us here, you can put a price floor. I mean, you can write the law however you want, but it's only going to be meaningful if I make the price be artificially higher, because the law is going to say it can go no lower than, let's say again, $20, even though the equilibrium price is 10. So in this case, 10 causes a surplus. We see it again primarily with the minimum wage, where the surplus would be known as unemployment. And so what would we see here? We would see here that, it's easy to think then that low-wage people are helped by minimum wage laws. But the reality, right, is that you then have to be lucky enough to find one of those jobs. And alternatively, you also have to start to ask yourself, is that law still reasonable? Or, especially in the case of the minimum wage law, is it the case that as conditions have changed, well, actually, let's just look at it this way, actually. Let's make our life more interesting here. Okay, I've not previewed any sites here, but do we get one? Well, I'm just going to pick a state that I know is really low. Oh, wow, they're no longer very low. Well, they used to be very low. Let's pick another one. Interesting. There we go. Good old Georgia. Georgia, the minimum wage is $7.25 an hour, which is the federal minimum wage. I think you'd be hard pressed to find any employer paying as little as $7.25 an hour. So in the state of Georgia, it's not that Georgians don't like poor people. It's just that Georgians don't even care enough to make a floor exist. They're just going to let the market figure it out, and it's almost entirely going to be higher than $7.25 an hour. If we look at California, which is going to be on the opposite end of the spectrum, that would be $16.50 an hour. And then you've got some localities, some local cities that have made it higher. Oh, look at that. Oakland, hotel employees without health benefits get $24 an hour. Not too shabby. Wyoming's going to be $7.25. If you're in a tipped job, $2.13. Wisconsin, my home state, $7.25. So I can tell you, at least with some knowledge here, I would be incredibly hard pressed to find any employer paying that little. They just aren't out there. So that would mean then again, as the consequence of this, is that if the equilibrium if the equilibrium is already higher than the $7.25 as a price floor, the reaction to that would be is, who cares? It actually doesn't have any impact on the market. So again, this would be a non-binding price floor would be when it's below the equilibrium. Binding price floors would be above the equilibrium. And the long run effects is that it causes a surplus. And there's our non-binding. And our binding causing that surplus. And that what we see over time is that as the curves become more elastic, that the size of the surplus gets larger. Okay, there's our minimum wage, which I've already talked about quite extensively. Okay. I'm just kind of skipping a lot of slides here just because I guess the only other thing I can kind of add to this, because again, I'm presuming you can kind of read the slides. You don't need me to read the slides to you. Is that one of the arguments that's kind of being made is, should we, instead of having the minimum wage, should we be instead talking about the living wage, which I guess would be another part of the matter. If you're going to ask me as an economist, what do I think about price controls? Is that they're just bad ideas. They're bad ideas either because you've got a price ceiling and, you've got a price ceiling and you're forcing people to have to hunt down and try to hope that they can get one of these goods that are going to have this incredibly low price given the change in conditions. And so the market isn't going to properly sort out who should get things, right? Should I really get the mask just because I ended up being at the store first, even though the person that's really, really sick that needs the medical mask couldn't get to the store fast enough? That's not what markets are designed to do. Markets, right? The sick person should be willing to pay more for the mask because they really need it. So they should get it. And that's the beauty of a price. A price is a really good allocation mechanism. And it would stop being a really good allocation mechanism if we force the price to be lower than it would be. The problem with the price floor is that you make yourself come across as a really nice person who, wants to help the working person make sure that they are able to earn a wage that's livable. But the problem is that the minimum wage oftentimes isn't a wage that you can live on, right? Who could live on $7.25 an hour? And that the numbers that people throw out there are oftentimes quite random. Like even in LA, $20, like how'd you come up with that 20? That's just a random number. Like if your goal is really to make it so that people could live on it, then you would need to do an analysis and you would need to adjust that number based on how living conditions change. So what's my problem here? The problem is that price controls are often politically determined and don't have very much to do with economics, where we're trying to find proper allocation of products. Okay, so that's my discussion here of price controls.